The good life is a process, not a state of being. It is a direction, not a destination. Carl Rogers. Well, hey there. Welcome to the Retirement Answer Man Show. This is Roger Whitney. I am your host. This show is dedicated to helping you not just survive retirement, but have the confidence to lean in and rock retirement. Rocking retirement is creating a great life, and that is a process. That is not something you ever achieve and can put away and never have to think about again. I was thinking about this recently in planning out 2023 for this show. We're going to have some changes, nothing too dramatic, but I want to draw some sharper lines around process, around the 4 stages of the financial side of a process, which is vision, feasibility, resilience, and optimization. So as we have questions and we have topics, I want to make sure we label them appropriately so you know where they fit in a bigger process for you to actually do things. So we're going to do that within the show. We're also going to have a segment. I don't know what I'm going to call it yet. It might be heroic retirement or non-financial retirement isn't too cool, but we'll come up with a monocle. So we have a regular segment on mastering the non-financial. So I want to create some sharper lines around these things to help you manage your journey in creating this great life, because it is a process. It's a friend of mine always says, day one, today's day one. Every day is a renewal of the process. You got to start each day fresh, right? So I was thinking about that structure. So I like that quote. We're going to do this more sharply in 2023 and going forward, actually. One visual, I think in visuals and metaphors and analogies, when I think of these things, they help me make sense of the world. And I was meditating this morning, which I do every day. It's a new practice this year. I've been learning how to meditate. And it dawned on me, it's much like meditation. So in meditation, you have a mantra or something that focuses your mind and your breathing, right? That stillness. But the hard part about meditation is your mind always wants to go off and think about something else, right? What did I eat last night? What am I going to have for lunch? I can't believe they said that to me yesterday. Did you read that article? My mind always wanders off to these random things, and I always have to bring it back to my mantra and that stillness and that focus. I guess that's why it's training, right? But it's a little annoying because you think you would get better at it, and maybe I am and I don't notice it. And I was talking to somebody who is much farther along on this meditation journey, and they told me that is meditation. You never actually do meditation poorly. Your mind will wander, and it's the practice of bringing it back to your mantra. Now, why am I talking about meditation here? I'm talking about that because I think of that with process. In this case, the Agile Retirement Project that we think is a great way to do this. Your mind will wander to inflation, the latest economic reports, the article you read about Roth conversions, etc. It is natural in this 24/7 input world that your mind is going to wander. And the practice is always bringing it back to your process, just like bringing it back to your mantra. Okay, I read about that crazy economic report. Let me go back to my process and funnel it through the process so I can do it in an organized way and filter it using the process. I like that visual of the importance of a process because you are ultimately your habits and how you do things, right? So managing a process is really just having some standard operating procedures for how you manage your financial life or your developmental life personally. And so we're going to put some brighter lines to that as we move forward, because I love talking about this stuff. I can geek out with you on anything, but what I care about most is you actually creating a great life and rocking retirement. That's where the rubber meets the roads. I like thinkers, but I love doers, and I want you to be a doer, and I want you to rock retirement. With that, let's go on and answer some of your questions. stay warm and wrap yourself up in cozy earth this holiday season. I'm trying to get a head start on the holiday season and finding gifts for the people I love. And I got 2 rules. Number 1 is I want to find something that's a little unique that they might not think of buying for themselves. And number 2, I want to find something that's really high quality that gets better as it ages. And Cozy Earth definitely fits that bill. Cozy Earth has products all made from responsibly sourced viscose from bamboo. They have bedding. We have a set of their king sheets, which are amazing. They have women's and men's loungewear, all made from breathable and luxurious material that actually get softer as they age and you wash them. And right now, you can go to CozyEarth.com, find something unique for the one that you love, and if you use the code RAM, you'll get 35% off the entire site. So check them out at CozyEarth.com. Got a great line of questions, as we always do, because we have such smart listeners. If you have a question for the show, you can go to rogerwhitney.com/ask Roger, and you can type in your question. You can leave an audio question, which we try to bring to the front. So that might get you a fast pass to get on the show and have your question answered. So go to rogerwhitney.com/ask Roger. With that, let's dive into some of your questions. So our first question is from Greg, related to bond ladder. So conceptually, let's explain what a bond ladder is. A bond ladder is a way of purchasing a bond portfolio with individual bonds where you created a ladder. You know, if you can think of stairs going up, where let's assume you have a ladder from a 1-year bond, then you step up to a bond that matures in 2 years, and then a bond that matures in 3 years, 4 years, etc. And every time the bond comes due, the early maturity bond, in theory, you can just go out and build the ladder and build the farthest step out. So that's called a bond ladder. And Greg has a question about how to reallocate a bond ladder. He's been a 3 to 4 year listener. Awesome. And he took Wade Pfau's RISA test, and he says he's somewhere in between a time segmentation and total return in terms of the psychology of how he fits. And as part of that, he said he built out a bond ladder, a 10-year bond ladder, and it's really helped in this bear market, knowing that he has bonds that are maturing each year for the next 10 years. And I'm presuming, Greg, that you have that built out to fund your life in the year. So like a income floor, you've built out enough bonds that mature to help pay for life in the following year. And that is a way of immunizing yourself or protecting yourself against bear markets and wondering how you're going to pay for your life. I'm definitely an advocate of that structure with bond ladders. So his question is regarding, what do I do as this bond ladder comes due? And he says, assume I have a $2 million portfolio. It's 50% bonds, 50% stocks. The bond portion is a 10-year ladder with 100,000 maturing each year. In a bull market with rising stocks, it seems easy, but in a bad market, as these bonds come due and I'm sourcing it for my income, do I sell stocks when they're down to replenish the ladder, or do I rebalance to get to that 50-50 allocation between stocks and bonds? And how do you do that? Because when stocks are down, is that the time to really rebalance back to building this ladder out and getting to a target of 50-50 bonds to stocks allocation? And then lastly, he says, do I just wing it? I don't know. What's the methodology around this? It's a good question, Greg. In practice, the reason you've built this bond ladder is that this is pre-funding your consumption for the next 10 years in this case. Meaning that every year when that 100,000 comes due in your example, you're going to spend that money. And then the long-term portfolio, which you categorize as stocks, will have time to statistically have good results. Because if you look at time segmentation, as you describe it, a 10-year period, if you're invested in 100% stocks, there may be one instance in the last 100 years where over 10 years you actually lost money. So statistically, it sets the stock portion up for success. I don't think it's appropriate to frame it, Greg, as I have a 50-50 allocation. At least I don't do it that way. I think of the bond ladder as a separate allocation that is funding life as an income floor. The rest of the assets that are not in that income floor will have its own asset allocation. And it may be 100% stocks, but it could still have its own bond component. So when you're rebalancing each layer, you're looking at the individual layer and doing its own rebalancing. Now, to the question of what do you do as you burn off this bond ladder? Do you pull from your upside assets, the more aggressive assets, to rebuild your 10-year ladder? It's between winging it and making a organized judgment on it. Part of the advantage of having that income floor, Greg, as you're talking about, is that you can make the decision to do a few things. One is, if markets in the world are really, really bad, you could moderate your spending, which lengthens the time frame of your bond ladder or your income floor. You could just moderate some spending. You could allow it to burn down rather than replenish it. You could replenish it partially and moderate spending. The good thing about this structure, in my mind, is that it gives you multiple pathways and they're all reasonable. Perhaps you let it burn its way down for 5 years, which allows you to give the upside or the equity portion time to statistically go through its cycle. The key here is not what is the right way to do it. The key here is you're giving yourself slack in the system so you can create multiple pathways that you evaluate year by year that are all reasonable to navigate this situation, right? Because there's not just one way to navigate it. And that idea of multiple pathways that are available to you is the benefit. Whereas if you don't have this type of structure, you have less pathways because you have less of a runway in terms of funding your life. So hopefully that gives you some framework. I know in the club, we're going to build a decision pod on how to think through this in an organized way with some resources. In practice, I do this collaboratively with the clients and it becomes a judgment call and we just try to think through it together in an organized way. So I don't have some little template I can give you at the moment, Greg. So hopefully that helps give you some framework. Our next question comes from Rich. And Rich says, hey, I have dividends and interest from my portfolio that generates enough from my income along with other investments. Is it better to do that, just take the dividends and interest to fund my life, or sell 3% of my portfolio monthly or yearly to generate the same income? It's a good question, Rich. So you have enough in assets to cover your expenses just off of the dividends and interest. You can go both pathways. And I think if it generates enough to cover your life, they're going to issue those dividends and the interest is going to be issued annually, whether you take it or not. So if you choose to reinvest it, it still becomes a taxable event. So I think it's a totally reasonable pathway to just simply not have them reinvested. Use that to fund your life. What that will do is you'll lose a little bit of that compounding effect of buying more shares right now in down markets that could potentially help the long-term growth of your investment assets, assuming that you have equities. Another consideration there is dividends are generally solid, but dividends can change drastically depending on the individual companies you own or the portfolio. If times are bad and companies cut dividends, so you want to be careful about the quality of dividends. If you choose to sell annually and have all of these things invested, Rich, I actually would suggest that don't do it annually. Create a 3 to 5 year in actual bond ladder, similar to what we just talked about with Greg, where that money is set aside and not at risk at all for 3 to 5 years minimum, and then let everything else reinvest. That way you're not getting into this systematic selling program and you have some confidence of exactly how you're going to pay for life. But I think both pathways are reasonable. Our next question is from Mark on sensitivity analysis to your retirement plan.
Hello, Roger. My name is Mark, and I've been listening to your program for about 3 years. So thanks for all your help. I'm currently within 1 or 2 years of retirement, and I use new retirement planning software to help me on the financial side of retirement. I'm currently working on a project to do a sensitivity analysis around some of the main variables and how they would impact my retirement success on the financial side. I'm wondering if you have any advice for how I could systematically do this, or if you can point me to any resources to help me out to do a good analysis around those main variables for my retirement. Thanks for any thoughts you have.
I think the best resource for you, Mark, is to tap the resources at New Retirement Calculator, which you are using. They have a great educational platform. Michelle, I know, hosts a lot of meetups to talk about how to do these things. So I don't know specifically for that tool because I don't use it. Now, this sensitivity analysis is going to be in the resilient stage of your project. How resilient is your feasible plan? So let's put it where it should be. The type of sensitivity tests that you want to create, I think, are around a few items. Number one is sequence of return. What happens if I get bad sequences? How does the feasibility of my plan react? With New Retirement, they do have some Monte Carlo scenario planning. As of this date, I don't think it's fully evolved from the last time I looked at it in terms of the sequencing of return, but that's an important one of the big ones. The second would be a premature death, meaning that assuming you're married or have a partner, what happens if one of us dies prematurely? How does that impact the feasibility of the plan? The spending is going to probably go down a little bit, but not by half, because housing and all those things are pretty constant. You have other things coming in play, though. You have Social Security benefits on your long-term analysis are going to go from 2 to 1, and you have tax consequences in sense you're going to go from a joint tax bracket environment to a single tax bracket environment. I know we're actually going to do a month-long series next year on going from 2 to 1 to talk about some of these issues in detail. Plus, you might have some implications in terms of other human capital, or social capital, whether it's pensions, or human capital, whether it's part-time works. So you want to test, what happens if one of us dies early? How does that impact the feasibility of the plan? And then the last one I'll mention here are healthcare shocks. What happens if I get Alzheimer's or my wife gets Alzheimer's, and some frameworks around that. In performing the sensitivity test in this resilient stage, I would suggest that you create a feasible plan of record, whether it's in spreadsheet or New Retirement or whatever tool you're using, and then create a what if scenario where you dial one test. What happens if I die early and my spouse is alive? And look at the feasibility and the impact of the feasibility using whatever tool you're using from your feasible plan of record to that event. And then you can test the next event. What happens if we have a healthcare shock? How is this playing out? How do they compare my feasible plan to this event happening? Do that for each one of those. And if you want to get really fancy, you could say, what happens if we have a healthcare shock and a bear market? And you can go crazy with this stuff. But that's the framework that I'd want to do it. And that will help you identify. And really all you're doing, it's like a scientist. You want to observe, my spouse will be fine if I pass away early. Even at the tax brackets, I don't have a need for life insurance, but I do have a need for maybe more Roth conversions. Or the converse. Oh, wow, I still do need life insurance, at least for this number of years. You can observe the impact to the resilience of the plan, and that will help you when you get to implementation stage to shore things up. And it really is like a scientist. You want to do it in a logical way so you can observe it and then make decisions based off of that. So hopefully that gives you some framework, Mark. So our last question today is related, and it comes from Terry, and I'm going to read the whole question. I'm 60 and looking at retiring soon. We know all of our assets and income sources. We have a flexible spending plan budget with specific inflation adjustments, which we'd like to start. We are aware of all the different tools that are available: 4% rule, Monte Carlo, historical audit, funding ratio. Know there are a lot of variable assumptions that can be made using these tools: inflation, asset allocation, rate of return, years in retirement. We understand that there are differing opinions on what is considered a success from a result standpoint. Is there a specific set of tests with any specific variables and with any certain success values that you recommend for a retirement income plan to be determined as sound? So essentially the question is, how do we measure enough? That's what Terry is asking. How specifically do I know if I have enough? I'm going to tell you what you need to hear, not necessarily what you want to hear first. And that is, there isn't any. There is no answer to that question that would allow you to put this to bed and put it on a shelf. It's not knowable. There are just too many variables involved. Inflation could run 3 times as high. Markets could be really bad. You could have health shocks. You could have family issues. All sorts of things can come into play that you really cannot predict or totally plan for. I know that's not what you want to hear. If you can't figure it all out to know if you have enough, and this is where I came to in my journey in developing my expertise and wanting these specific things, Terry. If you can't get those, then you have to switch your mindset in your framing and focus on process. So you can continually iterate using reasonable assumptions. Now you asked for what specific tests. Pick any of the ones that you talked about. I don't like the 4% rule. I wouldn't do that one. Monte Carlo audit, historical audit, funded ratio using a household balance sheet. Any of those are fine. Put it all in there. There is some debate of what's a good enough number, success ratio, say on Monte Carlo, but there isn't that much of a debate. They're all roughly within the same ranges. What specific tests? Well, I just named them in the prior. I would test what happens if one of us dies early. What happens if we have a major healthcare or spending shock? What happens if our assets are haircut? So let's go through each one of those. What happens if one of us dies prematurely? Create a what-if scenario. Make some reasonable assumptions of what the surviving spouse is going to spend. That's going to be more art than science. And then see how the numbers come out. Using your spreadsheet, if you use Monte Carlo, it'll adjust the tax rates, etc. What about a healthcare shock? Make an assumption. Let's say at age 75, one of you has to go have full-time care at $80,000 a year for 5 years. That's a reasonable assumption if that event happens. What about a sequence of return? My suggestion would be make an assumption that you experienced the Great Recession, that's October 07 to March of 09, today. So you have your plan. Your alternate scenario is I haircut my assets, my financial assets, by the amount that my asset allocation would have gone down in the Great Recession. So I'm rattling these off at the top of my head, but if you have a 60% stock, 40% bond portfolio from peak to trough, I believe it went down around 24%. That's your allocation. Whatever tool you're using, let's say it's a household balance sheet, lower your assets by 24% and rerun the analysis. So if you want some specific things that I think are reasonable and sound, I think those are reasonable and sound. But the true answer is you're never going to know. So process is important. And I would, in your plan, and you can't really spreadsheet this out, I would put more value to having flexibility, whether that's doing some part-time work early, whether that's having really high confidence on the base great life, knowing that the wants and the wishes may have to be more flexible. But optionality is one of the most undervalued things in retirement planning in general. And so I would focus on knowing that, making sure you have a lot of levers that you can pull. So with that, let's go set a smart sprint.
On your marks, get set.
And we're off to set a little baby step you can take in the next 7 days to not just rock retirement, but rock life. Om, om, om. What is your mantra? What mantra do you have? What process do you have that you filter through all the decisions that you have to filter through so you don't just run and chase your tail? Find one. Doesn't have to be ours. I think ours is pretty well thought out, but have one so you can always think in a logical way. So what is yours? Do you know it? All right, I actually have Taylor Schulte just hopped on to help me record another episode, so I'm going to let you go, and we'll chat next week. The opinions voiced in this podcast are for general information only and not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. All performance reference is historical and does not guarantee future results. All indices are unmanaged and cannot be invested in directly. Make sure you consult your legal, tax, or financial advisor before making any decisions.